Good morning, everyone, and it's a real honor and pleasure to be here. And General Ham, thanks so much for the kind introduction. I'll start off with, the business of next weekend. Who's going to win the Final Four there is probably on top, but I think all the brackets have pretty well been broken in many respects. I was struck by what you said, General Ham, about the Office of Business Transformation and what it does. And Mr. Robin Swan is here today, my deputy, and I spent a lot of time when I came in. I've been in position about 6 months about what does the office do? What's its value to the department? And its value to the department is it's the one organization that sits on top of the Army staff that's actually an honest broker. And so it's been given some rather tough missions. And what I mean by this is think back to the reorganization of the Army staff and take a 25% cut. Well, any of you that have been involved with taking down headquarters, it can quickly devolve into a unmanageable process and create a lot of conflict that takes a lot of time to solve. But when you put an organization on top of that, that is seen as fair and honest, and to be blunt, some don't always see it that way, but I think it provides the Undersecretary of the Army, the Chief Management Officer of the Army by statute, which is who I work for, a tool by which to do this. And so when I first got in there, I looked at what we were doing and a lot of conversation with Robin, and I said, Robin, up to this point, I think we haven't been so much the Office of Business Transformation, we've been the Office of Business Improvement. And what I mean by that is we're kind of on the margins of some of this stuff that's what's really possible. Having been in a number of transformational organizations, there tends to be a disruptive nature of transformation, which means what? People are mad at you for what you're doing. And we don't have a lot of that with the exception of the initial reorganization. So I spent some time trying to understand what we're doing. I'll just use a little example of why this office is important. And I'm going to use, I see the soldiers in the front here, and all these soldiers in the front of this podium here, they like to take leave. And so for our business partners in here, let me explain how that really works under the current system. Basically, they handwrite a form, and that form goes through somewhere between 12 and 13 steps to get up to the human resources portion of the Army. And then when they come back from leave, for that to be fully executed through the enterprise of the Army, there are now 7 to 8 more steps. All of that is manual. Well, you can think right now, wow, how many transactional errors take place here? Well, thousands. And because you're dealing with DFAST, every time there's an error, we get to pay for that too. And so when you start to think about it, there's a new program called coming on to handle the personnel systems of the Army, and Jim McConville heading this up here, and it's called IPSA. And IPSA, working with a PeopleSoft background, that's now going to be 2 to 3 steps. And the idea is that we'll work on a mobile device for the soldiers. Now that's transformational, and every one of those soldiers there will feel that. But when you look across the processes of the Army, there's stuff like this all over the place if we start to work on it. When Secretary Mattis came in, if we listened to his testimony, his third priority was to reform the business side of the Department of Defense. When you listen to the congressional oversight committees on top of the department, you hear them talk a lot about reform. When you listen to President Trump's messages, you hear a lot about business reform. This is coming to us. It hasn't come in the way perhaps as we would see, as fast as we are, but I would say a lot of that is because a lot of the political appointees in the department are not yet in place, and certainly none have been in place yet for the Army. So as we go forward, I see that the importance of this position is going to grow. And the challenge is, okay, so how do we organize now for what we know is getting ready to come? So the Army's been relatively successful so far of putting in some big enterprise systems. So let me start like this, just the business mission area, the information technology systems, there were roughly 800 systems. Now you can imagine the interfaces between them. We had Gartner come in and do what's called a time analysis, and it puts them in categories of invest, mitigate, eliminate, or tolerate. Well, as we now have a plan to bring this down, and Robin Swan's really led the effort on this. And so we're going to get down in the 400 range, but it continued to go down. But the reason that it's taking a while is first you have to actually see what you have. And even yesterday, as I was working through on the whiteboard there, this young officer said, "Oh, and we built this IT system to do this." And I said, where did that come from? Oh, we made it ourselves, and it interfaces with these systems. It reinforces this problem. But there are actually 4 mission areas with information technology in the Army. There are thousands of these systems. So what that does is it makes it very difficult to see the Army. Now the progress is made in a big way in a couple of areas. So first off, in the accounting area, GFIBs, and also in the logistics management program, LMP. IPSA is still coming online. But coming out of the cyber world, I realized there's something missing here, and that is, where's all this data going? So these systems are normally created to move data around to enable decision making. And we realize that we don't have a data approach for all of this yet. There are a number of flowers blooming in this area, but what I would say is we need a complete enterprise look at how we're going to manage big data, because I can see rapidly in the next couple of years, given that a lot of the data challenges have been solved by private industry already and not just brought into the Army, we need to get there. So what do I mean by the data challenges? If you think you have 400 systems, just think about the way that date might be entered into the different systems. And if those are not aligned properly, then you're going to get a ton of errors. And I just talk date, think names, think the way you, financial accounting, how many decimals, and I could go on and on and on. And then that's just taking data to correlate. And by correlate, I mean answer this question: how many tanks do we have in the Army? Well, that's just straight database query, right? But another question we might want to ask is it possible for us to tweak, using conditions-based maintenance data, to tweak turbine engines to be much more efficient in climates over 100 degrees? Well, I think intuitively, I think that's possible, but we have no data that says that. And this is where you start to see the power of artificial intelligence, Monte Carlo routines, et cetera, which we do not tend to use. A lot of our data right now is subjective in nature. Subjective meaning best military judgment, which is essential. And I absolutely believe in this. However, it's helpful if when you run these routines, enter a black swan event, what's the probability of that? What's this? And so you have a better way to look at the risk that I think actually enhances decision making. I learned this because when I was at the Cyber Grand Challenge, which was an incredible event this year, cyber event, and I asked those young teams, what's the future here now that we're developing automation in cyber? They said the future is man-machine interface, because man-machine still beats machine every day. And so when I started thinking about that, and I'm not talking about plugging in like the Matrix or anything like that, I'm talking more about using data analytics to enable better decision-making, better strategy. The other thing that we're doing is with the enterprise resource programs is what's the cyber risk, right? So coming out of my other world, when you start to aggregate all this data, that starts to become an OPM-like problem with our security clearances. And so we've been using a best business practice. It started with the Defense Digital Service, where they had a program called Hack the Pentagon. And then we brought that down to the Army, hacked the Army. And now it's like, let's use the same kind of system against certain parts of our information technology systems. And I think that's a best business practice to use these kind of red teams. But what's so powerful about it is you're getting the best of the outside to come do this, and as well as the inside. I want to talk a little bit about innovation. So the Army Ideas program was canceled a couple years ago, and last year there was a data call. What are you doing in terms of innovation? And we realized we didn't have a plan. And when you compared us to the other services, it looked a little worse. And so since then, we have the Army's Ideas for Innovations SharePoint portal. It's open to the whole Army. So now we're harnessing the power of these soldiers in front of us, because these soldiers have some incredible ideas. The problem is it doesn't make it to the top of the department. But now, because it's on a SharePoint portal, comes in and can be passed off to the appropriate staff agencies to operate. May not be perfect, but it's started, and I think it has potential to harness the power of our workforce, which is a huge part of innovation. I want to maybe close with this last thought here. So I've talked a little bit about just the challenges in IT. I've talked a little bit about what we're doing with the enterprise resource programs. I've talked about big data. I've talked about cyber. I've talked about a little bit about the business relationship. But a lot of what I'm talking about is how do you lean out your processes? And actually, businesses do this quite well, because they're driven by a bottom line, and we're actually normally, I would say many of us, and myself included for a long time, didn't measure ourselves by outcomes, but measured ourselves by rate of obligation, right? That's how we get rated, right? Basically, hey, are you 90% done on this day? Are you 100% done on this day? Nobody said, what'd you get for that? And we've heard our chief talk about this here in terms of readiness. So to me, this is a huge space for one of my continual drumbeats, which is public-private partnerships. How do we leverage best business practices that are on the outside to run the business side of the Army? And the business side of the Army only exists to generate the warfighting capabilities that we need for today and for the future. And so that's, perhaps I'll stop there and take some questions. Right, so the hiring freeze is having an effect. I think that's fair to say. I think the department and Secretary Spear have put the best procedures that we could put in place, and we respond on those very quickly. I think there's some recognition. So the hiring freeze is for 120 days. The question is, right now the question is, what's going to happen after that? Well, it's clearly, if you just look at the administration, there's the need for smaller government. Well, smaller government to me means we need more efficiencies, right? What the hiring freeze is causing everyone to do is look really hard at their organizations. So we didn't put the hiring freeze on. I would describe it as we react to what we have, and we make decisions on what we can and can't do. I do applaud Secretary Spear for putting in a very rapid process for processing the waivers for this. So it's having an effect, and that's because, you know, we have 200,000 civilians. If you just do the regular 200,000 plus civilians, if you just do the regular math, the attrition rate alone over time is going to hurt the department over time.
Morning, Secretary White, AT&T. You spoke about innovation and industry. Can you talk to what are your thoughts about how do you bring the Army to do more interaction with industry so that you can learn those best practices?
So I think a lot of it starts with the leaders, to be blunt. You know, my example I normally use is, so I'll take your company, if I remember right, your investment in IT, S&T, or information technology, science and technologies, is somewhere in the $7-8 billion range, if I seem to remember right, since I've been to AT&T. Am I close? And you know, the Army's entire S&T budget is $4 billion. So when you start stacking up AT&T with Microsoft, with Google, with Verizon, well, I think there's a better way to leverage what we're doing, and so that would be an example. I think organizations like AUSA help because you know, often it's very easy for us to stay in what I call in the Army and not have the exposure that we need to understand what's possible. I actually, I was explaining even to General Sullivan earlier that I was in just a recent meeting and we started talking about interfaces with big data, and many of you know, if you want to build an interface, the average cost of that is $1 million. And so this particular program had 200 interfaces, and I'm asking if they were going to use an electronic service bus, and I realized that most people in that room had no idea what I was talking about, right? Yet, if we have people that these problems have all been solved by a company like yours already. This is not something that needs technology. It needs organization, structure, process, understanding. And so that's where I think, and as you well know, the competition over data scientists is enormous, both inside and outside. So I think that is one way to do it. I'll probably stop there.
You mentioned that you have the hybrid screen. I'm also wondering what impact at all, rather the budget stability and some uncertainty around 2018 is having on your team. And also, I understand you have a fairly small team, so if you could address interaction and collaboration with other offices or
yeah. Okay, so the first one, I think the Secretary in Chief have talked, and the Vice have talked quite often on the challenges with not just insufficient funding, but the lack of stable and predictable funding. So I won't go further into that. I think that's clearly, you know, on the record. And, you know, like in front of us, we're still under a CR today, right? That's not good. We're on the 1st of April, we're halfway through FY17. So now, you know, in 3 more months, even if we get it, can we execute everything? That's going to be the next problem. And General Sin dealt with this in spades in his former job here. So how we interface. So the way I would answer that is a lot of what we do is business process reengineering. So a lot of people don't understand how it fits in the end-to-end life cycles. So to deliver trained and ready forces right here, we believe there are 14 end-to-end life cycles. So an example of what am I talking about? Hire to retire is a life cycle. From the minute we bring a soldier or civilian into the Army until they retire, that whole thing is a business process. So what does that look like, and how do we work to both gain productivity and get efficiencies out of that process? There's actually, we believe, 14. So we don't own those. The one I just mentioned is owned by the G1 and Manpower and Reserve Affairs Assistant Secretary. That's who owns that. So we work with them on that, and that's how we're organized.
Sir, good morning. Tom Smith from Messenger. Thanks for coming. I think the piece you touched on with innovation and the piece that talked about that businesses are doing it now. How does industry come to OBT and have a discussion about the things that are in place across Fortune 500 companies that the Army may not be doing? It's people, process, and technology. The technology works. I can show you a variety of industry verticals where it's working today, but it's a domino issue. Some would say, how do we groom our leaders? How do we train our workforce? How do we tie the threads of the Army Network campaign plan, the business strategy, et cetera, et cetera? Patrick Murphy would say that if the Army was a Fortune 500 company, it would be a Fortune 10 company. How do you interact with those folks, particularly in my space, the IT systems that the bulk of those companies use that perhaps the Army is missing out on?
Yeah, so this is not a new problem for me. I had the same problem in cyber, right? And I believe we need more mechanisms for public-private partnerships. I think a lot of it is, so let's just start with the people, right? If the people don't know how to ask the right question or are not current on the technology, that's an issue, right? So Esri Geospatial, right? Enormous world leader. That's what you said, right? Esri, right?
Sure, that's correct.
Okay, so I happen to know this because I was the chief geographic officer in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We used Esri products in 1995, okay? So, and so how, the question is, to me, when you answer that, it's like, okay, how are we leveraging GIS systems in the Army? Well, having been around, I think some parts of the Army use it quite well, the Corps of Engineers, for example. But the other parts of the Army haven't recognized the power of doing it in other places because they're not trained that way. They're not educated that way. That's one. Then the next piece is, how do you go after the processes? So, to be blunt, I think a lot of officers are rather scared to meet with industry because they get all these legal reviews that say you can't do this, you can't, but you actually can. You just have to follow the rules. And so I think that is important. And then the technology, to me, like these soldiers always have in front of the podium here, or sorry, lectern, have a, you know, they have a lot of good ideas. They have a lot of ideas on what would be great to be geolocated and to be able to be presented in a way that they could actually act upon. And so I completely agree with the way you laid that out. But I think part of it's on us and part of it's on you, right? Which is you have to continue to work to find those people that are going to do that. But I know, for example, everything starts with maps. That's what I say, right? Even from the very beginning, we're all second lieutenants, we're all sergeants, we're all soldiers. MET-T first, right? And that's terrain. Terrain is ingrained into us from the beginning. So, okay.
Hey, Ed.
Yeah.
Todd Semonite. So let's talk about a little bit about leader development. You know, officers and NCOs, we are here to be able to fight and win America's wars. But at some point, you know, about 80% of the senior guys are running the business side of the Army. So we talked innovation, IT, all those other ones. When you think about what skills and attributes does a senior officer need to run a large business, what's that blend of warfighting versus business? And are we doing enough in the right places to groom people coming up through the chain so when they are in senior jobs, they're able to have the ethic of fighting and winning the war, but perhaps the business acumen to be able to, you know, be able to find efficiencies. How does that balance work?
So you're on one of my favorite topics here. So let me answer that maybe three ways, right? So first, I believe all, especially officers, have a requirement for self-development and should have an aggressive reading program. Hopefully have outside mentors that help guide that. You know, and I've been lucky to have this since 2003. But I'd also say this goes to what's, you know, some people are calling learning agility. So learning agility meaning it's the ability for a senior leader to rapidly adapt into a new situation, right? Because a lot of it is, as you know, I used to talk about this in the cyber world, or I'll even say in the engineer world, I may not be the greatest expert at geotechnical engineering. I'm not. I just have to be able to organize that as part of a larger structure, right? So that's the first one. The second one is I'm wondering, and this is my own personal opinion, that the idea of getting rid of dual tracks might have hurt us really bad in the long run. Because what happens is it's a perception that if you're a warfighter, you have to stay only in warfighting. And if you're over here, you stay only over here. Yet when you look at kind of the top of the Army, that's not the way we're organized, right? A lot of us are served in assignments that are, you know, not, we kind of went back and forth. And many in this room have done that. And so I'm actually wondering if that might be a organizational structure problem long term. It's served us well where we are, but where we're going, I'm not sure that can stand if we want to be better in this area, and I do think we do. And then the last piece is, you know, I think we continue to work on what. I'll just give you one of the things I think about a lot, and I use with General Milley. It's I call it the 1914-1917 problem. So this is being the 100th anniversary for a lot of the great divisions in the Army. You know, 2nd Infantry Division turns 100 years old this year. So I think about this more. If you take a soldier from 1917, you drop them in 1940, they will basically be able to recognize everything they see. It's more modern, but the structure is kind of there. But if you took the same soldier from 1914 and dropped them in 1940, They didn't see a lot of that. That's all new. So what I worry about today, where are we? Because I see some things are like, you know, it's, we have this tremendous force, but then I also see this, you know, what Bill Hicks came to give a great presentation on here on, you see a strategic environment with technologies that are very, very different than what we were seeing even 10 years ago. And so it's our ability to recognize that and then to educate ourselves in this to be able to then go forward. And then what does that mean to the business side of the Army? So I just read one of my reading assignments over the weekend here was a book called Lead and Disrupt, which I thought was pretty good because it talks about big organizations have normal processes. You have that take one type of people, culture, innovation, different type of people, different culture. Normally, big process kills innovation. And it's really about, many of you have seen this with Innovators' Dilemmas, how do you balance both within one organization? And this is how most, you know, Fortune 500 companies used to be able to survive for 90 years, several years ago, and now the average time for Fortune 500 companies is 15 years. And it's like when you think about it that way, that is extremely disruptive. We're a, you know, over 200-year organization that's innovated like crazy. But how do we take what they're going through? We don't see all this, and for us to make sure that we have both competitive advantage to me meaning that we will be able to out-innovate. You have what you have when you start, but you can go faster and out-innovate before you finish, right? And overmatch. So to me, you need both. And the competitive advantage is the business side of the Army. The business processes have to move as fast as the warfighting innovation. They're not doing that right now, right? And then overmatch, we need overmatch, especially tactical overmatch. So long answer to that question, but.
Thank you very much, General.